Good evening, comrades, and welcome to this evening's Zoom discussion organised by Talking About Socialism from a Marxist point of view. My name's Minnie. I'll be chairing tonight's meeting for the first time on TAS. This is one of our regular fortnightly public Zoom discussions, which we've been holding every other Monday since March 2023. That's quite a long time now. Tonight's discussion is on the middle class, as in the bulletin that went round. And that's going to be introduced for 20 minutes by Peter Kennedy. And Peter's also written an article on this subject, which you can view on talkingaboutsocialism.com. He's written other pieces there too, so go along to talkingaboutsocialism.com if you want to have a read of that. Before I call Peter in, just a few matters of meeting organisation. Once Peter's finished his introduction, I'll open the discussion up for contributions and questions. You can raise your electronic hand. If for some reason you can't do that, then wave at the camera or put a message in the chat and I'll be looking out for that too. We usually ask people to stick to 3 minutes for contributions so we can ensure that everyone who wants to speak can come in. But obviously we can be a bit flexible about that, but I will come in and ask you to wind up at some point, and you can come in again later in the meeting. Just to say, this meeting is being recorded and it's going to be shared on YouTube channel, Talking About Socialism's YouTube channel, on Facebook. So just be aware that what you're saying is going to be broadcast. We'll close the meeting at 9 p.m. Obviously, we'll bring Peter back in before we close it as well, and maybe during the meeting as well. For those of you who are watching this on YouTube, please press the subscribe button and the like button and post any comments underneath the video. That way we build recognition for what Talking About Socialism, or TAS as we call it, is, and what we're trying to do. If anyone's interested in joining TAS and broadly agree with our statement on the About page on our website, and would like to get involved in forging communist unity, which is going on at the moment with Prometheus, CPGB, RS21, we've got a world to win. We've got so much to counter in this world. We need to change the system. We need communism. So if you're interested, do join, and we have regular meetings, and it'd be great to see you on board. It's always good to see a bulletin go around. We've got a new member. Anyway, with that, I will now ask Peter to introduce tonight's discussion. Thanks, comrades.
Great. Hi guys, thanks for inviting us to do the discussion this week on the middle class. As you know, it's part of like an ongoing debate within the communist fusion talks. And it's also of interest anyway, the middle class to Marxism anyway, because it's a not controversial issue, but it's a kind of sticking point in how we see things developing within the working class, and things like proletarianization of the middle class or not, you know, as the case may be. So tonight, I think I'm going to beg the question, to what extent will middle classes retain a vested interest in capitalist relations and pose obstacles to a transition to communism, which necessitates a long transition period? So will the middle class become a kind of sticking block to that kind of process? And yeah, towards a longer transition. So in posing the question, then we are assuming that there's a transitionary process in place. I'm assuming that, you know, assuming this transitionary phase of communism, which involves more than an isolated country, otherwise it wouldn't work, it would collapse, it would be brought to a halt by the capitalist class. And we're assuming that workers have abolished the capitalist class ownership and control, and that there's no value, surplus value, extraction, and so no exploitation of labour power. And lastly, that we assume that the relations of common ownership hold hegemony in the production of services and products based on democratic planning. Specifically, what does that mean? Well, it means that large capitalist enterprises have been abolished and reconfigured under common ownership of workers. the capitalist distinction between private and public has been erased. The global supply chain of SMEs, previously economic vassals to the large capitalist corporations, are now in an environment which is different. The environment is commonly owned large enterprises with no interest in the supply chain super exploitation of labour power. So with those assumptions, it might be worth looking at. I've done a diagram. It's not the greatest one in the world, but it might give you an idea of how my messy mind works trying to come to grips with. So I'll put up the share thing. Okay, so you should have something there with the diagram. Can you see that? Yeah, great. Okay. So the diagram is really trying to get to grips with how different classes can figure in the relationship between capitalist and worker, the extraction of surplus value, and the rewards that are shared out because of that. So if you work from left to right, that's probably the best way of doing it. Then we have the zone of capitalist exploiters on the left, the upper left quadrant there, under the dotted arrow. And so everything on top of that baseline, that central baseline, the dotted arrow, is the zone of capitalist exploiters, and below is the zone of workers exploited. And if you look across there, then we get an idea of some of the class divisions and where they sit in mediating positions. So I've coloured all the forces that are aligned to the capitalist class on the purple, and I've given the capitalist class a brighter colour, yellow. And in the box below on the left-hand side, you can see how they marry up. So the darker yellow of the capitalist marries up with ownership and control of capital, surplus value. The yellow text with the purple, in the purple boxes, are for those who sell labour power and to earn an income and gain an extra large salary because they take a share of surplus value, the services rendered to capital. So we have the two bottom layers, which state professional elite and capitalist professional elite, public and private sector. And above that, on the left-hand side, the state apparatus, those involved like the civil service and criminal justice system and so on, political class, who are involved in the state apparatus either ideologically or in terms of the roles they serve and to maintain capitalist hegemony and the function of the system against the working class. Now, in the red, beneath them, is the sort of contradictory location, if you like, of the SMEs on the left-hand side, middle. And I've coloured the medium in terms of it as yellow to signify that they should really be placed with the capitalist class, because medium enterprises are anything above 250 employees, so they are on the way. They are capitalist enterprises, and so the same thing will apply to them in the transition period. Their roles will be abolished, and they'll take on new roles within the transitional phase of communism. And so will too the two purple boxes in the middle contain the state professionals and private sector capitalist professionals who are in that contradictory class location of selling labour power, but also sharing some of the surplus because of their managerial control and functions over professional labour, the groundswell of professional labour in the state sector and the capitalist sector below them in the red boxes. And then we have the working class. And the idea is that those in red, when workers are in power, would integrate all those in the red box under the zone of be exploited, and they would be part of the working class in transition to communism, working to establish communism. And as I say, the roles above in the purple will be abolished, and micro, small enterprises will fold into the red side of the below as part of the working class. So I hope that's clear to you, and I'm just going to go on from there and kind of giving my thoughts on the contradictory positions of the SMEs and also professional labour, and why, given the kind of environment that they share, then they are reasonably expected to gravitate towards communism without any real delay. And on the other side of that is there'll be the abolition of the capitalist class along with its apparatus and the managerial strata. So there should be no delay there either. So that's the argument. So let's just kind of have a look at. We need to obviously when I look at first the SMEs. So we need to remember the broader context, because it's important to understand of the growth of SMEs over the recent years, and that is as you know, the imperialist-driven global commodity chain capitalism arising from the regime of capitalist accumulation for over 30 years that we've come to know as neoliberalism. So this global supply chain capitalism has grown over 30 years, and and it arose on the basis of the defeat of the working class in the period of social democracy, with the decline of trade unions and so on. So it established the context for deindustrialization, privatization and deregulation of public sector enterprises, manifesting in the global outsourcing and downsizing of capital and the global redivision of labour. So the SMEs have grown substantially on the back of this change in the regime of accumulation of capital. And it's a hostile environment straight away for SMEs. So bear in mind that the context is one in which SMEs serve the object of raising the rate of massive profits in an era coming out of social democracy in the 70s, when both of them was prone to decline in rates of profit and a shrinking mass for large enterprises. So you do that by making use of cheap sources of worker labour power within intensive and mostly non-unionised work settings, imposed fragmentation of what was socialised labour under social democratic regimes of accumulation. So SMEs have blossomed in this period. Now, estimates suggest that they're around about 450 million globally, and the UK has about 6 million SMEs. We need to drill down a bit, and as I mentioned before, the medium enterprises, those employing over 250 or more, represent a tiny fraction of SMEs. And they will be integrated, and they are integrated in the capitalist class, and they will be abolished at the same period as the capitalist class role will be. However, most of the SMEs are small businesses, and 90% are micro enterprises employing between 1 and 9 workers, and they make up some 90% of SMEs. Many micro and small enterprises have their fate dominated by global corporations who utilise them as an outsourced, sweated asset. Conditions of work are often highly exploitative, insecure, and a health and safety nightmare due to long hours of poorly paid labour. So they're really far from examples of a burgeoning middle class. So those who maybe want to link the rise of the middle class with the SMEs have really got to look at the conditions under which small businesses work, the proliferation of small businesses, and also the larger context of global capitalism that I've just very briefly mentioned. So we'd have to ask questions as to whether their stake in capitalism as such is as such that they must be gradually won over to communism over a longer period of time. And if you move to consider other kinds of small enterprises in which are the outcome of privatization and deregulation of state sectors across the developed economies, imperialist economies, then we have a legion of small enterprises, for example, in the NHS, education, housing and benefits and welfare system in the UK. And they circle around the NHS, providing contracted out services, employing workers intensively over mostly insecure, precarious contracts. And notwithstanding the TOOP measures, which is the transfer of undertakings of protection of employment once workers was transferred out of the public sector, notwithstanding that, because there were so many loopholes in it, then they experienced the rough end of the kind of labour process and the rough end of exploitation. We've only got to think about privatisation of social care. And now that's the kind of mushroomed over the post-Thatcher years. And we can talk a lot more about them, but I just want to move on quickly. Even small enterprises, often professional services and accountancy, legal services, medical, technical, do so to escape corporate capitalism in a way. The dull, repetitive work, the oppressive bureaucracy, managerialism, which is characteristic of large capitalist corporations, and the latter's deprofessionalizing effect on their autonomy. So even these small services, they may earn a profit, but that's usually takes the form of the person's wages or income, and the main goal is to kind of maintain the organisation and the provision of needs. So it can be very different from the kind of logic of capital within these small enterprises, where everything's about increasing efficiency, driving down working conditions and so on. They usually have a direct relationship with the clients or consumers at the end, and then so they're not tied into so much into these kind of supply chains, which impose a discipline upon small enterprises. So so that's and we should bear in mind as well that venture capitalists, I'm sure you've heard of, have kind of taken a big interest in the deregulated smaller businesses around the public sector and begun to buy them all up and become part of the chain, which is rationalised, and they offer services which are of higher price and so on. We see this again in the care industry, and we also see it in veterinary services. So if you've been to a vet recently, you'll know that, or you may know that the local centre has probably become part of a broader network, and the prices have shot up, and there often are all sorts of sexy technological medical solutions to your pet, which cost an enormous amount of money. So so the workers there, professionals, maybe lose a bit of their professional autonomy in the process. So I'm just trying to paint a picture, and we can go into more detail here, that the SME
5
is
minutes,
not good.
Peter.
Well, the SME is not a good place to. I might take another 5. That's okay.
No problem.
All right. So so it leads to the question: do they have a stake in capitalism? It would seem reasonable to suppose that they don't, and that the transition to communism would provide a much more stable context. If you think about it, small enterprises that are engaged in providing products and services useful to society will be transformed with little effort into local communal networks of production, democratically run within the overall governance of workers. and they can only prosper as far as I can see under that, and they can only remain in intensely competitive relations under capitalism, which leads to all the alienation and exploitation that we know so much about. So also the point as well, SMEs would now be linked in our transition to communism to commonly owned and controlled large enterprises, which would put an immediate end to the supply chain super exploitation. Now, if we turn just quickly to specialist middle class occupations, is their stake in capitalism such that they have to gradually be won over to communism over a long period of time? So on the one hand, you can split the professional class, middle classes in a way, between a top, a hierarchical elite, whether it's in engineering, science, and so on, who are basically engineers, managers in a kind of managerial role. And they're there to coordinate the work of their colleagues, professionals, and they earn a distinctly different salary. I know this because in academia where I work, and if you look at the higher functions of management, there was always an on-running complaint from trade unions about the enormous salaries distinct from their own professional colleagues that these people had been provided with. And that's because they earn part of a share in the surplus, either direct from capitalists or in the case of education, indirectly through tax distribution. So, but the majority of professionals work at the forefront of socialisation. In other words, the collective power of their professional labour is utilised within capital-intensive industries and labour processes. They sell the labour power to capitalists and the state in crucial industries, and can be seen there right in the middle, those in the boxes there. Capitalism, these jobs come under threat from continuous profit-driven efficiency drives and rationalisations, and most crucially for the existence of the occupation itself, the deprofessionalisation consequences of AI. So we just look at, in more Marxist terms, professionals, for a number of reasons, are within the environment that they're in, which is like a socialised collective environment, where they work as teams and so on, then their professional autonomy may be under threat anyway, and has been under threat. So if you like, in Marxist terms, the working class have always been different and seen as different because they experience what Marx called formal and real subsumption, their subordination, if you like, by capital. The formal subsumption is briefly through the wage contract and the labour market. The real subsumption is in production, where workers work actively, or the workers' activity is controlled by the management and by the organisation of machinery and technology in ways that Marx described in chapter 14 and 15 of Capital, Volume 1. Traditional assumptions about the middle class are different. The assumptions are that while they're formally subordinated, they're not, or they've resisted real subordination at the level of their own workplace, at the level of production, where they retain a sense of autonomy because of the professional expertise they have in the intricacies of the job. And this is replicated to a lesser extent with skilled workers and so on. So, but there's a number of things, and I haven't got time to go into them. There's reasons to suggest that they're experiencing real subordination to capital, and that's because an elite managerial strata within the profession, as I mentioned, now they take control of professional labour, and we could look further at how that might happen. And this is according to the requirements of efficiency, of capitalist efficiency, to generate accumulation profits. And also professional know-how and expertise is being socialised and so transformed by technology, allowing the possibility at least of less skilled workers, possibly the middle class that have been hollowed out over the past decade, to begin to take up some of those, or be retrained some of those roles, to allow less skilled workers to carry out tasks. And as kind of further evidence, we have these phrases of, or terms of employment, paralegal, para-accountancy and paramedics, which signifies a kind of like a deep professionalization of sorts and expansion of roles, without an expansion of the specialism, the deepening of it. And on top of this, and this fits in with trying to keep the costs of professional work down, they've suffered more intense formal subordination through, and if you look at this, a large amount of professionals who are on fixed term contracts, called entrepreneurial professions, working in platform capitalist environments, more insecure labour, less career bound. And we can see that in my own occupation, academic labour, you see in IT programmers and journalism and so on. So to finish off, start the discussion going, it would seem reasonable then to suggest that professional labour would clearly have a lot to gain from the qualitative shift in direction in the socialisation of their respective sectors in communism. Communism will provide all specialist workers with a greater say in how sectors are run and what genuine socially useful purpose they serve. So on the two counts of those kind of professionals, then I can't see any reasonableness for suggesting there's going to be a long-term transition period. In the case of the state apparatus, then those professionals will be abolished. In the case of high professionals, that role will be supplanted by workers' control anyway, and given to the only professional labour, which it's I've spoken about just then. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks
I'm sorry
very
about
much.
that.
No problem at all. You could have had another minute or a couple of minutes, but thanks for that, Peter. It's a lot to get in. And say again that Peter has got an article on Talking About Socialism website about this. Come in later in the meeting anyway, sum up at the end, but if there's time, you can come in again. Right, so time for, I can see Billy's already got his hand up. Yeah, so just a reminder, we generally ask people to stick to 3 minutes. Obviously, we can be a little bit flexible with that, but you can always come back in. So we'll wind you up at some point. And if you can't put your electronic hand up, just put a message in the chat or wave at the screen. I'll try and be watching out for that. Okay, Billy, do you want to unmute? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Minnie. Thank you, Peter, for sharing your research. I had a few points of disagreement with the article that you shared, more so than the talk. I don't know that I'll be able to get everything in 3 minutes, but I'll try my best. So relating to the article, in the section small and medium enterprises, you're obviously responding to Jack Conrad's piece in the Weekly Worker. You seem to be responding to a different question from him, where Conrad is talking about small capitalists. You're talking about the position of the workers in those small businesses, workers who are employed by small capitalists. So it seems like a different question. It doesn't seem that you kind of addressed what Conrad says in that article. Towards the end, there's a section titled Top Brass, which seems to confuse Marxist understanding of class with a sociological approach to class. I'm wondering, maybe I've misunderstood, but I'm wondering which side you would come down on. Any of the well, with possible exceptions, any of the examples you give there of, I can't remember how it's worded, middle class professionals or whatever, are subject to proletarianization, as you've sort of argued yourself in your talk there. I got the same sense from the diagram you shared, though possibly that's me not, I found it quite difficult to understand, so that might just be on me. You talk as well about small and medium enterprises folding into the working class was a phrase you used, I think. They will be abolished, things like that, gradually won over to communism over a long period of time. I feel like that needs a bit more spelling out exactly, well, not exactly, none of us can predict these things, but how that will happen. And on that point, I'd wonder what you, assuming you're aware of it. I'd wonder if what you would make of the points in the CPGB's draft programme. There's a section on small businesses and farmers with several proposals there. I wonder if you think they're of any use. One final point, if I may. You say that the small and medium enterprises don't appear to stake in capitalism. They'd have more security in communist society. I think that's true, but it's kind of trivially true. I think it's true of large capitalists as well. Marx makes the point in the appendix to Capital Volume 1. He says that the capitalist is enslaved by capital just as much as the worker. It's not a point we often make, but I think it's true. You can think of examples of like Quaker and Methodist industrialists who would love to not be capitalists but not exploit their workers because of their very strong moral convictions. But unfortunately, it's not possible. So I think it's kind of a trivial point that they'd have more security in communist society. That doesn't, just stating that doesn't help us make the case. I hope some of that made sense. Thank you for the time.
Thanks for that, Billy. As we say at TAS, we welcome, different points of view. We welcome, questions. There's no silly questions at all. So we welcome all comrades contributing. Right, I can't see any more hands up at the moment, but I've got a couple of comments in the chat. So I'm wondering whether, Jeff, I know you put a comment in the chat. I don't know if you want to come in or maybe you want to come in later. And also Frank has put a comment in the chat. So Ed's got his hand up now. Ed, do you want to come in? Thank you.
I think Nick had his hand up before I did.
You go ahead, Ed, and then we'll get Nick
But he
next.
doesn't want to. Okay, I'll come in very briefly. I think, this idea of people who are part of the apparatus without themselves being capitalists and, without themselves owning capital, I think is probably a helpful one. I think it probably bears some more thinking about, but I was just sort of reading through Peter's article before this, and I should say as well, thanks very much to Peter for the talk and the introduction, which is really, really interesting. And the way that Peter's put it is this: there's a top brass at the top of other middle class occupations: law, criminal justice system, police, military, senior civil service, and I think that that's right. And I think that if you can think about it this way, maybe Peter would disagree with me or think this isn't a helpful way to think about it, but by and large, you do not get appointed to those kinds of positions or rise to the top of those parts of the professions or the state apparatus without being judged to be politically sound and safe from the perspective of the capitalist class. It's not impossible, obviously, that people can have dissenting views to a greater or lesser extent, and I think that has been shown to happen in historical situations in other countries. You've got chiefs of police in particular towns or people in the army who are sympathetic to communism. But I think the kind of default goal with those is you only get anywhere and get to those top positions if you are consciously willing to be part of the apparatus and to defend that apparatus. So I think it probably is helpful. I don't think, for my part, there's anything un-Marxist about it. But I'd be interested to hear what other people think about it as well, because I'm very much just kind of developing what I think about it. So I don't have any fixed position.
Thanks, Ed. Is that it for now? Yeah. Yeah, great. Okay, I'll call Nick in next, please.
Thanks, Minnie. Thank you very much to Peter for your presentation and for the articles in on the TAS website. They're very interesting and they provoke a lot of discussion. I just want to focus on one or two brief points in the 3 minutes that I've got, and partly take up what Billy says. I think there were very good points from Billy. I've read the CPGB draft programme. I can't quite remember everything that's said about farmers and small businesses, but there's a commentary. And insofar as it points out that small farmers and the petty bourgeois small businesses are basically trapped by the concentration and development of the concentration of capitalism, I agree with that. And they're squeezed. And most small businesses can only aspire but never reach the ranks of the big boys who dominate the capitalist economy. I think where I have a difference with the programme of the CPGB is in what the approach of the communists coming to power, the working class coming to power, should be. And so I just want to take a step back, because I think if we discuss the programme in the abstract, we can have all sorts of arguments. I think it's important to understand, or the way I see it, and it ties in with what Peter has helpfully outlined. We're trying to popularize and win people to communist ideas now. And most workers are not communists. Most workers won't agree with our programme. So we take it for granted that at the moment we're a minority and we're trying to win people to our programme. And the only way that I can see that we do that is by explaining, as Peter was doing in outline, explaining why the bulk of humanity would be better off under communism. I'm trying to write an article at the moment saying, under the headline, "Only communism can save the pub," because the pub, independent pubs, are being closed down. I think it's at the rate of something like 16 a week. They can't live in the capitalist environment. And so on the one hand, we've got to win the battle inside the working class, because that's the force that is going to change society. And we've got to try and win people in the intermediary strata. And the middle class is a strange mix of all sorts of different people. My job, I'd be called a middle class job. I'm a barrister, but I'm a communist. My profession took strike action 2 years ago, which was pretty much solid. Very few, I don't know of anybody that broke the strike, and we won. So there has been a process taking place for 100 years of the proletarianization of what were previously middle class professions. So if we are going to come to power, and this is, I'm going to probably have to stop in a minute, if we're going to come to power, it means that the working class has won a large section, if not the majority section of the population. I understand all the international dimensions and so on. I don't have time to go into that. But it means that if the working class comes to power in any one country, it's won the argument in the working class. And it's inevitable, in my opinion, that it's won large sections of the petty bourgeois over to it. And the question then arises, when the working class is in power, what's its job? And in my opinion, its job is to socialize under initially working class control all aspects of production, so that there is, as Peter said, no creation of surplus value. It's just use values that are produced. And it breaks the alienation, it breaks exploitation, and you can't have capitalist production in communism. So in order to get to communism, you've got to socialize things. I think that if we've come to power, it means that we've won large sections of that petty bourgeois to our programme. And those that remain, obviously, we continue to speak to them, but the working class will integrate those sections into the socialised production, whether that's small pubs or whatever. Thanks, Minnie. I'll finish there. Thank you.
That's great. I mean, obviously we let people expand points, and So 3 minutes isn't strict. Soraya, could you come in, please? Thank you.
Thanks. Just to continue, yes, thanks very much, Peter, for your introduction. And it may be, I was trying to look at your diagram, and it may be that I didn't read it properly because I either couldn't read it at all or I blew it up and it was so big I could only see sections of it. I understood from it that after the working class had taken power, then there was a suggestion that capitalist enterprises would still continue, and I think this is leading on from what Nick was saying. And I agree with Nick. I don't think that would happen, because if they would continue, who would be running them? And by the very nature, capitalism is exploiting. Is exploiting for the surplus value. Who would be doing the exploiting, and why would there be a need for the surplus value? I'm just, it may be that I haven't understood what the diagram was saying. I know that the CPGB have this idea of a lengthy interim period, and I'm not quite sure that I really understand this argument. I don't, parenthesis, I don't think that when you've taken power, that when the working class has taken power, that you're automatically, everything's going to be fine and in a state of communism. But I don't think, as long as there's no isolation, I don't think that that would be a prolonged period. And so you wouldn't, the capitalism has to have a state to enforce and arm bodies of the state to enforce and maintain the continued exploitation of the working class, and that's what lies behind everything, including the law, if you strip it back. But it's, yes, my query is, who would be doing that exploiting? Because if you've taken power, then the power is no longer in the hands of the capitalist class. So who is going to be doing the running? And I also think that I know the question of these enterprises and small enterprises. Well, I think Nick, I won't repeat what Nick said because I think he dealt with that. I think that a lot of people in these medium style enterprises that for a short period might think they have a stake in capitalism, and Peter, you're right that there can be places where people are super exploited because they're small places, and so they I'm thinking of microbreweries or whatever, because of to be able to keep their heads afloat. That's not a justification for exploitation. I'm just saying that the way it is. But it's also because people are conned into thinking that if they have their own business and work their socks off, then they will make their way in the world, in this capitalist world, and they'll be able to look after their families and so forth. And we know that in the end they can't long-term compete with big companies. This is moving on to the topic of winning those people over if they are allies of the capitalist class, and I'm not too sure that they are.
Thanks, Soraya. Let me just, don't think I can see any other hands up at the moment. Oh, Barry's waving. Barry, would you unmute? Thank you.
Can you hear me? Right, okay.
Yeah, that's great. We can hear you, Barry.
I do think it's important to have an understanding of the objective structure of society. Peter's presentation helps us to do that. But I think the point was made that a sociological approach or a focus on structure is not entirely adequate, that class is defined in struggle, and class consciousness and classes are formed in struggle. So there is a fluidity to definition of classes. And what I was concerned about is that we can't simply assume a transformation has been completed. We can't simply assume capitalism has been abolished and start from there. We have to start from the revolutionary process itself, and that includes economics as well as politics, not just for the CPGB. It's a democratization of the state in capitalism, democratization of capitalism rather than a revolutionary transformation. It's more evolutionary than revolutionary. So if you look at, say, for example, if you're thinking in terms of class, then you have to think in terms of class hegemony. You have to think in terms of class leadership and whether the middle class will be attracted to the working class parties and organizations, or whether they'll side with the capitalists or some other force. So if you look at, say, Germany in 1929, 1933, in that capitalist crisis, the two working class parties were not seeking revolution. The Social Democrats were supporting the lesser evil and then ended up supporting an evil, fascism itself. And the Communist Party was not seeking revolution either. Its main enemy was the Social Democrats. It thought were social fascists. But in any case, the Soviet Union had all kinds of economic and political links with the German regime, including the fascists, and it had it saw the fascists as an anti-Versailles, anti-Western force, which at that point in time they thought were allies. So because the two working class parties could not provide a solution to the economic crisis for workers, the middle class, not just the middle class, but a large section of the workers, went over to fascism and extreme nationalism and scapegoating ethnic minorities. And that's the danger today, of course. So, I mean, the issue is really about, what we can do in terms of working class organization to attract the middle class. Now, Peter's been pointing to how capitalism itself will undermine the middle class perspective and will drive them towards the workers. But we also have to look at the political and the subjective, the ideological aspect as well.
Thanks, Barry. Okay, I've got anybody who hasn't spoken who wants to speak for the first time. I've got Billy's got his hand up. He's spoken before. It's fine. I'm just coming. But is there anyone that hasn't spoken that wants to come in? Just bring Billy in then, and Peter. Do you want to come back in for 5 minutes, or do you want to leave it till the end, Peter?
Yeah, I can do
Yeah, so if
both of those.
we'll take Billy and then you come back in for 5 minutes. Yeah, great. Okay. Okay, Billy, thanks.
Thank you. Just very brief question for Soraya. You say that the CPGB advocates a lengthy transition period. I'm just wondering what specifically that's based on. All the draft program on the transition, all that the draft program says on the transition is that socialism is not itself a mode of production, but the transition from capitalism to communism, and that the division of labour cannot be abolished overnight, which doesn't really, to me, say either way whether it'll be a lengthy or a very brief transition because, of course, we have no idea really. Thanks.
Thanks, Billy. Just before you come in, Peter, we've had some comments in the chat. Let's have a look. We've got, I don't know whether you've read much of Jeff Barr, much of Peter's presentation is sound. How far are we being trapped here in a kind of economic reductionism? In a crisis that threatens the power of capital, politics is central. What joins in effort to overthrow it depends in large measure on the immediate political situation. And then Jeff's also said the state admin is huge. The First Division Association changed to the FDA to seem less elitist. Many of its members are unsympathetic to their rulers. Frank has had something in the chat. You can't treat the middle class in a linear vacuum sort of way. They will be affected by escalating class struggle. Some may join the workers, some may stick with the bourgeoisie. And then we've got Frank says somewhere in Lenin's work saying not only the working class, but the ruling class may decide we all need a revolution. Look at the types of revolution: national, popular, bourgeois, workers. You can't ignore the politics or simply put the prevailing atmosphere of discontent in our times. And Kirsty, middle class now is totally different from even a century ago. There are workers in council, workers in the NHS, etc. So would they go with the elite or the communists? Peter, I'll give you say 4 or 5 minutes now, and then we'll bring some more speakers in before you finish. Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Minnie. Yeah, I think just the general point first before I address questions and that. I think I was, I agree that obviously the politics are important, fluidity of class struggle, the fight for the working class to gain hegemony within capitalism, win the arguments amongst different groups, and especially within itself as well, the divisions it has in itself. I think all those are key, but my paper was assuming something different, and that is that I was basing it on a reply to the CPGB. Billy, I think you'll find as far as I remember, within the Weekly Worker, there was in reply to the Fusion talks about and the way TAS view things in terms of the abolition of capitalism. And you find in their reply, I think it was from Jack Conrad in particular, this idea that there would be a prolongation. And he mentioned in that the role of the SMEs, that here we have like all these millions of SMEs and the evidence of like middle class. Now, you could be right there, and that's a good point that you made, that, it's the capitalists there. But, and that role would be abolished, yeah, I agree, that role would be abolished. But there are SMEs of professional labour as well. And so I suppose what I'm saying there is that they would be won over to the working class. Now, the pitch of the talk was, as I said right at the beginning, that, and I took the pitch from the CPGB and the Fusion. The pitch of the CPG and the Fusion was that in the transition period, on the way to communism, with workers in power, it would take a hell of a long time, a prolonged period of transition, because we have to bring the middle class on side in all, whatever groups you want to entertain as being middle class, they would have to be brought on side. So my talk was about saying, well, is that the case? Say we did have, we were on the road to transition. Now let's look at the class structure now and see where workers are at now. And ask yourself, if we're in transition, what the hell would they, or what reason would they give reasonably to say that they want the old system rather than the transition with workers in power and all the politicization that implies, and the vision of a different world that implies. So it's on that basis that I kind of frame the talk in structural terms rather than political terms. So you mentioned that the other point, Billy, which is, for me, the top brass are nothing really to do with professionals outside the state, but the state apparatus, and including the military, criminal justice system, higher civil service. Those that keep the state capitalist power ticking along ideologically and materially. And they would be abolished along with capitalists, because they would be included for me, they're capitalists, supporting the system. So in that transitionary period, they would have gone, right? Another thing that would have gone is the top layer of the professionals who become managerial control experts over their own profession. They're earning a share of the surplus. If they're in the state, it's indirectly through taxation going to them and to form part of their salary and wages. If they're in the private sector, it's a direct share with capital, and they've got interest directly with capital then, because it's their corporation who they work for that they're in this enormous difference in salary, and they're far more attached to the capitalist class. So they would definitely, that role would be abolished. So the CPG draft program, farmers, I haven't really looked at the farmers, in Europe, I think the farm work, agricultural farmers, independent farmers, are 0.4% of the working population, so it's quite small. But obviously, if you look worldwide, there's an enormous amount of small farmers. What you also look at is they're part of that supply chain, corporate supply chains, capital supply chain. If you look at coffee production, just for one example, lots of small independent farmers are being screwed every day, work intensely, can't support themselves, no welfare system, no means of providing money for the kids' education. Most of the value is sucked off into the chain up north to the big corporations. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks for that, Peter.
Yeah, you're waving your hand, so
I was doing the circle.
Okay.
Get off. You can come back on later. Yeah, I was just gonna say, we've got Barry coming in next, and then we've got Ed, and then Nick. So can I ask Conmo to keep the contributions if you can to 3 minutes, because we've got less than half an hour left, and obviously we want Peter to come in at the end and sum up as well. Okay, thanks, Barry.
Okay, I just want to respond to Billy's point. Now, for Marx, it was quite clear that that the abolition of capitalism would mean a new mode of production. If you read Capital or his writings on the Paris Commune or the critique of the Gotha program, it's quite clear that a revolutionary transformation would mean a new mode of production. So you'd abolish capitalism and you go into communism. Now, the CPGB leadership don't agree with that. They have a transitional regime instead. You don't abolish the means of production, you have a transitional regime where you aim for democratizing the state and democratizing capitalism. And the leaders have been quite clear in all their conversations, in all their responses to TAS, that it will be a lengthy period. Indeed, I think one of them said it would be 100 years, or was it? Anyway, it would be decades. Now, that's completely at odds with Marx and his writings. So just a final point. So we're not talking about a transitional regime between capitalism and between communism. We're talking about a revolutionary transformation from capitalism to communism, a new mode of production. And the CPG leadership are at odds with Marx on that one.
Thanks, Barry. Right, I'm going to get you in the right order next, Nick and Ed. So it's Ed, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Minnie. Yeah, just a brief one, just to respond to Billy, because it is important to get this right and know what everybody is arguing. I think it's important to state that the CPGB comrades, it's certainly in the FCU meetings, I don't know if it's made it into print, but they have said, of course, that they would like a transition to be as quick as possible, but of course that it will take as long as it needs to. But in terms of what they do say about the length of it, there may be things further back than this, but you can look at Jack Conrad's article in this week's Weekly Worker, or perhaps last week's rather, Program and Chips, where he says, as for socializing everything, we agree, but slowly, given the emphasis there, spaces in between all the letters and italicized. And if you want to go back a month or two ago, an article called Rediscovering Our Words. And in that, he says, task comrades want to substitute the minimum program with a few vague phrases. He says, likewise, the comrades deny, skip over, denounce any notion of a transformation period, long or short, perhaps lasting a generation or two. And so, of course, that's not what we've argued, so we can dispense with that point. But he is positively endorsing the possibility there of a transformation period which might last a generation or two. If we want to sketch out the dividing lines in really broad terms, I would say that if a transition lasts a generation or two, then it's in real trouble, and its viability can be called into question at that point. I don't think it makes sense to be perhaps much more precise than that, but I would say, is that a revolution, a transition that's actually succeeding or going anywhere? That's it.
Thanks, Ed. Nick, can you just hold back for us a minute? I've got Chris and she's not spoken before. So Chris, would you like to come in? Thank you.
Thanks, Minnie. Yeah, interesting discussion. I only really want to make a very brief point. Just on the transition stuff. I think we can get caught up in this debate, and it's an interesting debate and what have you, but we run the risk of being hostages to fortune. And, you know, if you're writing that the transition period will take hundreds of years or what have you, you know, you are laying the basis then for possible that you foresee a defeat or that you will live under capitalism for 2, 3, 4 generations. And likewise, you set yourself up to be hostage to fortune if you say that transition will be very quickly, because we do not know the circumstances in which we will come to power, in which the working class will come to power. We cannot be confident that the working class will come to power in Europe or North America. We may be a long way behind comrades in North Africa, South Asia, or what have you. And the ability to build socialism in economies that are not as advanced as those in Europe or North America, you know, we have seen examples of such things failing before. So we have to be careful, really, in this debate, not to put too much emphasis on it, but we know what will happen when the working class will take power. You know, I'm often reminded of the anarchist Durruti when he says, you know, the bourgeoisie will blast and make ruin of the world before it lets go of it. And, you know, have no fear, I'm paraphrasing, but have no fear, we will rebuild it all anew because we've already built this world once and we'll build it better. And I think that really needs to be our mentality. And in terms of this debate, the transition debate and how quickly we go and what have you, it's very interesting. We must be very, very careful to not elevate that above the principle that we all share, and which is the idea of the working class coming to power and making its own future, and one that can't be dictated from the present today. That's all I want to say, really. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That's great. Nick, would you like to come in?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I'd like to thank Billy, first of all, for coming along and posing these questions, because they're really, really important questions. And we can only scratch the surface in an hour and a half. I thought Peter did an excellent job, and I particularly liked the way that he came back, because if you try to approach everything, you just don't really get to say anything. And I think Peter's concentrated on what he was asked to speak on, and that was speaking to his article. But obviously, things have been raised. So in terms of answering Billy, and also to an extent Chris, I think Chris has made a good point that it's all, you know, it can all be a bit abstract. But actually, the obverse of that is it's actually very practical and material, because it's a question of what goes into the program, and what the program of the Communist Party is for the working class coming to power. My reading of the CPGB program and my understanding of the arguments that have been put forward in the FCU discussion is precisely as Ed has outlined them, and that Barry identified, is that the working class comes to power and basically it democratizes capitalism, and the minimum program is implemented. But as the comrades rightly say, the minimum program is compatible with capitalism. Whereas my view is that the working class, if it comes to power, must come to power to more than democratize capitalism. It must come to power to socialize entirely the means of production under working class control, and in the process abolishing itself as a class, abolishing the production of value in society. The state withers away because you no longer need an oppressive, repressive military force to impose the rule of the ruling class, and you end up with communism. And I think there is quite a difference in the program of the CPGB in terms of what they're really aspiring to, and it's very difficult to grasp hold of, because they talk about the transition from the dictatorship of the proletariat to full communism. Well, Marx didn't look at it like that at all. In the critique of the Gotha program, he talked about the transformation from capitalism into communism and emerging as communism, which then develops. But it's communism that develops. So I think this debate, there is a danger, as Chris says, that it becomes abstract, but it's actually very important for what the program for the working class is. If it comes to power, does it allow capitalism and exploitation and the creation of surplus value to continue, or does it take every step to ensure that it doesn't? And that's what the point of these debates is about. Thank you.
Yeah, obviously ending the profit system, exploitation. We don't want that. Okay, so there's no other hands up at the moment. Does anyone want to come in briefly before I bring Peter back for say 8 minutes, Peter, 10 minutes? Anybody else? Let me just scan the hands. Oh, Barry, yeah. Barry, do you want to just come in quickly? Thanks.
Actually, just to reiterate Nick's point that of coming to power, for the working class to come to power, it has to come to power economically and politically. There has to be economic freedom and political freedom. And I don't think Billy will find that in the CPGB, because they're quite clear about a political freedom, about political democratization rather than economic and political freedom, because that would mean building a new mode of production. So I think Chris made the point. It's about coming to power, but it's not abstract. It's not abstract.
Thanks, Barry. Okay, it's 20:43. I'm just going to scan for any quick hands again. Right. Peter, do you want to come in for 10 minutes or so now?
Yeah, I might even take that long.
Yeah. Is there anybody else who wants to speak? I know we've got a couple of comments from Frank, who says it's about the timeline. Revolution is a probable response from socialism to communism. It could take a long while, but that doesn't mean hammering home the minimum maximum program. And then a compound effect from socialism to communism. Who knows the dynamics and velocity and timeline, which we've been talking about. Yeah, so yeah, go for it, Peter. Don't think we've got any more hands up. Thanks.
Yeah, just to return to some of the questions or comments. Soraya, thanks for your comment there. I think I believe that capitalist enterprises would not exist and not be part of what I was speaking of before, because again, going back to the premise, if you return to the premise of my talk, then the premise was the abolition of value, surplus value, and so capitalist ownership and the means of production. And in that way, we can understand the absurdity of the role of like small to medium enterprises, and you know, they would be facing a kind of large scale enterprises, socialized enterprises under the common ownership of the working class, who are on the way to kind of like organising a democratically controlled plan, which they would want to be a part of. And in fact, when you look at capitalism now and we speak of socialization, then the way it's developed since the 70s and the redivision of labour and capital mobility that's taken place since then to now, you know, sometimes we call it neoliberalism, is such that the socialization of capital has increased, but it's done so in a way that fragments and atomizes the working class and fragments capital too. And so you have large corporations which continue to exist, but they've shed their production processes and fragmented them across the world and their distribution processes. And that's so that more, you know, they can gain access to cheap labor, they can gain access to non-unionized labor, and they can, and with the digital revolution and IT and all the rest of it, they've been able to like increase the efficiency of transport and supply, you know, supply information, communication systems and all the rest of it, cutting down the circulation time of capital. But the major point is this all speaks to the socialization of capitalism. It's just that it's been fragmented onto capital because it wants to produce profits, expand accumulation, expand surplus value, amass profits, but control workers as well. And that's part of it. They didn't push any, you know, they didn't think about this too far ahead, but by hook and crook, by, you know, the changes that have been put in sway since the 70s, which we all know and read about, of the outsourcing and the mobility of capital and finance and its use of Southeast Asia, you know, imperialism, heartland use in Southeast Asia, then we get a remapping of socialization on a bigger scale, but in a fragmented form, which increases the depoliticization of labour at the same time as it gains another grip on profitability. Because once you go out and redivide labour and you're drawing in labour that's cheap and pliable and you put it with latest technology, then you're going to kind of like give a new lease of life to the rate of profit and the massive profits that are earned. If you look at the corporations in the USA and all the, you know, the major heartlands of capitalism, then they're sitting on quite a lot of money. A lot of it goes off into the financial markets where they play and gamble away and doesn't go back into production because they got too much of it. They're sitting on it. And that's because this period has come to an end, really, this period of like amassing these profits. And yeah, they don't know really what to do next. And they're talking about AI, but that reduces living labor power, which is like a vampire they have to kind of suck on for the surplus value. And so that's going to be a problem for them. So we're in a bind, but the main message is that we're in a bind, but it's through the socialization of capitalism, but in different forms. That's all in social democracy. Less based on nation states where you have like a large enterprise and you control with fiscal policy, Keynesianism, and more a different environment. So I would just say that. And that also means, going back to what you said, Nick, that it does kind of give us hope that if workers do take power, some of the architecture of what's there can be transformed by workers. You know, the use of connections between big, you know, local, national, global, between big and small kind of enterprises. You know, we're not going to blow them all up. We're going to kind of infuse them with workers' relationships once we've got rid of capitalism and new relations based on associated production. But we won't throw the baby out with the bathwater there. Capitalism digs its own grave, as Marx says, and it continues to do that today in the increased socialization. And I agree that, you know, there's all the materially speaking, we can make a good argument that the transition is not going to be that long for reasons what I've tried to mention today and other people have mentioned, but also because of, the fact that we have quite a lot in place at the moment, and the only longevity, or the lack of being sure about whether something's long or short is when workers are going to be able to take power. Once workers take power, then imagine the level of politicization that's taken to win that power and earn the right to govern, and have abolished large swathes of the capitalist class and the roles that they've taken, and taken production and services and products in their own hands. That's the kind of politicization that is required. But we don't know. I think people are right. You don't know whether it's going to be long or short. If it'll happen, we don't know. But one argument is to say that if it does, then we do have a good case of, a scientific approach just to understanding the forces, the relations of production, the force of production that make a possibility of a long transition or a short. We do have that. It's not like an open question. It's not a form of speculation, which is based on what specific play of balance of class forces. Workers will be in power. The forces of production will be given. There'll be to a certain extent. We'll know where they're being abused. We'll know where to direct them. It's not going to be rocket science,
Peter,
Okay.
have you finished, or do you want to say more? You've got another
I'm just
3 or 4 minutes.
I don't think I've got a reply to anyone else, so I'll shut up. So
Yeah, okay.
okay.
Thanks for that, Peter, and thanks very much for your talk. Does anyone want to speak? Because I'd say we've got 3 or 4 minutes before our close the meeting. So does anyone want to come back in? I think we've got some new messages. Nick, do you want to come back in and make your point about working class being in power? And what was it? Let's have a look. Yeah, working class. Right. Nick's made the point here. The Communist Party, because Frank asked a question about what hasn't been covered, is the relationship between the Communist Party and the working class. So Nick's put a little reply to that in the chat, and he said, we want to create the horse to lead the cart, i.e. the Communist Party to win the working class to communism. This discussion is just one of many we will be having to help to construct with others the party that we need. So, and also, we have discussed that on other occasions, and that's a subject we will be returning to. Yeah. Okay, thanks. So I'm going to wind the meeting up then. Thanks everyone for coming. Hope you enjoyed the meeting, one of many. 61st or 62nd, is it? You can visit our YouTube channel, Talking About Socialism, where we have 60 different recordings. Join our Facebook page, Talking About Socialism from a Marxist point of view. Let us know what you think. If you watch the video, post your comments, post them on Facebook. You can comment on articles, on Peter's article, underneath the article on the website, talkingaboutsocialism.com. And just to say, comment if you broadly agree with our statement, which you can find on our website under the About button, and want to join us, fill the form in on the website and get in touch. Get involved in the Forging Communist Unity discussions. Hope to see you at the next meeting, which is on Monday, the 2nd of June with Stephen Owen. He'll be speaking on What is Reform UK, and I'll just tell you what the other meetings are going to be now. Give me a second. We've got... Right, okay, yeah. There's a spring bank holiday, I think. That's why it's Monday, the 2nd of June. So it's sort of 3 weeks in between. Then we've got Monday, the 16th of June. Will McMahon is coming back. He's going to review developments in the war in Ukraine. What do they mean for the working class of Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and the rest of the world? What should socialist communists say? And then Monday, 30th of June, we've got a discussion on a draft programme for United Communist Group, what should be in a Communist Party programme? What is a programme for? And how would we use it? Then on the 14th of July, which is Bastille Day, obviously, we've got a discussion on the French Revolution. What happened and what is the significance of the revolution for understanding the modern world? I think we're going to have another one on the Paris Commune, but the Paris Commune will probably be touched on that. So I just want to thank everyone for coming. I'm going to close the meeting now. Just check there's no hand up just with the last minute comments. No? Oh, thanks everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye.